So movie genres often ebb and flow in their popularity. Comic book movies have gone in and out of fashion. Faith-based films have gone from niche to the mainstream, and even westerns have been making a resurgence in recent years. But one genre that just seems to have remained dormant for a long time now is the family adventure film. And I think as a studio primarily known for its mature and artistic storytelling, A24 is an unexpected champion to try and breathe new life into the genre. So will the Legend of Ochi be able to revitalize the genre? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So, like I said, I think it's both surprising and a little bit intriguing, at least to me, to see a studio like A24 making a film like this. But the result from that unexpected union is mostly what you would expect, I think, for better or worse, because I really wanted to love this film for reasons which we will get into, but for the most part, it just didn't land for me. The Legend of Ochi is an occasionally charming, throwback family adventure story that showcases some brilliant puppetry and effects, but I think its dark and quirky tone kind of do push the limits of its PG rating, and will just make it a bit of a difficult sell for younger viewers, and also a lack of emotional depth, I think keeps it from resonating with the older audiences as well. The family adventure film genre arguably peaked in the early 1980s with iconic movies like E.T. and Neverending Story or The Goonies, amazingly all coming out within a 3-year window. There have been sort of occasional resurgences, probably most successfully with the hit show Stranger Things, but for the most part, Hollywood seems to have settled in on the idea that live action is for adults and animation is for kids, which I think is a simplistic framework that is kind of wrong from both directions. I think kind of from that perspective, at least on a conceptual level, The Legend of Ochi is a welcome approach. The film doesn't rely heavily on nostalgia the way something like Stranger Things kind of unapologetically does, but it is clearly no less inspired by those early 1980s style films, because The Legend of Ochi mostly unfolds as a typical boy and his dog tale, kind of in the mold of movies like E.T. Most of the expected genre tropes are present and accounted for. You have the young protagonist with parental trauma that leaves them feeling out of place in society. You have the cute creature companion or the mythological beings who are feared by humans but are actually just misunderstood. But what makes The Legend of Ochi unique, despite its very familiar narrative template, is its tone and more art house direction. There is a possible version of this story that is the more traditional swashbuckling tale with a Spielbergian sense of childhood wonder, but this is most definitely not that film. Instead, it almost plays out more as a hypothetical gritty live action remake of Disney's Lilo and Stitch, or perhaps to give another comparison, I think this is more Del Toro's 2022 stop motion version of Pinocchio than it is sort of the Disney fairy tale version. The film is rated PG, but it pushes the limits of that rating because the movie has a dark and almost oppressively gloomy tone, a very plodding pace, and I think a sharper bite than might be expected, based on the rating alone. Because I actually saw this movie with my two 10-year-old twin boys, and while there wasn't anything that necessarily made me groan, I did feel somewhat uncomfortable and could tell that they weren't really connecting with the story, kind of beyond just the cuteness of the creature. And I think there's almost an unresolved tension with this film for who exactly it's targeting to be its primary audience. As a PG rated creature film, the story itself largely veers younger, but I think sort of the more mature presentation does aim more to sort of cinephile adults. While the 1980s family films kind of told stories that I think resonated across age demographics, The Legend of Ochi instead seems to try and appeal to different demographics sort of simultaneously, and I think in doing so risks not really satisfying any of them. I think it does trust its younger viewers to handle mature material, which I think is commendable, but it also doesn't do a whole lot to entertain them. But if there is one aspect of this film that will delight viewers of all ages, I think it is the effects, because The Legend of Ochi is a very impressive display of old school movie making magic where all the Ochi creatures are brought to life using puppetry, and it is fantastic. I think kind of in an age of overly saturated and glossy CGI spectacle, there is something almost irresistibly satisfying and enjoyable about the film's more like tactile aesthetic and like, use of practical effects. And the effects alone, I think, are almost worth the price of admission. And I do hope that this film like receives some warranted recognition, come next award season. And just like beyond the creatures themselves, this is also just a beautifully shot film with some very like stunning cinematography and like visual moments. Fortunately, the story doesn't always match like the level of the visuals. Let's be honest, like an unhinged, hammy performance by actor William Dafoe is never a bad thing, but the film never seems to give like the same attention to like bringing its humans to life as it does its creatures. And some of this is the result, I think, of a noticeable lack of dialogue and a commitment more to like visual storytelling, and that is not a bad thing at all. But at times, it does leave the narrative feeling somewhat disjointed, kind of more a collection of like, ideas rather than a cohesive or like, developed story. And it just never really gives you reason to get invested in any of the characters, because you just never really get to know any of them. Also, on the surface, I think it is like a wholesome story of like reconciliation, but there is also a like subtle religious undertone that may point to more like undesirable directions, which we'll get into in just a second. As far as content to consider, like things going on the surface of this, probably more than you would expect from a PG-rated film. For language, I counted 5, 6, 7 kind of more minor profanities, including words that begin with S and A, and at least one use of G, D. For violence, not a whole lot here, although you do see some kind of characters with mildly bloody wounds and injuries from like falling or having objects fall upon them. In one scene, an Ochi character bites another on the arm, and you do see like sort of the teeth puncture marks, and kind of the arm begins to like swell up from the wound. And earlier in the film, a character is shown like flipping through a book in the library that does contain some like somewhat violent illustrations of people who are either killed or bloodied from kind of confrontations with the Ochis. For sexuality, nothing going on in this film. The only other kind of content stuff to note is that, as is often the case with stories like this, the young protagonist makes plenty of decisions that parents probably won't want their own children to go and mimic, such as like running away from home or like stealing from a grocery store, or even like stealing and like driving a car. As far as themes, worldviews, like things going on beneath the surface, I think there are several possible like kind of thematic layers going on. I think kind of the theme likely to be the most agreeable to Christian audiences is one of like reconciliation, because Yuri is a young girl dealing with like the fallout of her parents' separation, and like as she endeavors to help sort of this Ochi youngling find its way back home, in many ways that journey serves as a sort of like metaphorical one for her own search for like home and belonging. And in the film, like the Ochi creatures communicate largely through like song, with the singing said to express like their deepest emotions and to like meld together into like a unified song with one another. And so I think it is fitting that like when that musical event eventually does occur in the film, Yuri is flanked by both of her parents. And like whether that is like reconciliation between the parents is not made entirely clear. But for like Yuri herself, she seems to have sort of reached the end of her own journey through like grief and uncertainty and just found her peace. Where things do get a little murkier, however, is when it comes to the film's like approach to religion, because the movie opens by establishing a very like stark tension between sort of the traditional lifestyle of like the secluded island setting and like the arrival of the modern world. And William Dafoe's character is someone who seems to be like stuck in the past, depicted as a sort of wacky like religious fundamentalist. He quotes like apocalyptic scripture from like the book of Revelation and approaches his like hunt of the Ochis as some sort of like religious crusade. I think that he has also like gathered a troop of young boys to join him, with his mentorship and like influence clearly revealed to be negative and corrupting by the end of the movie, does put his character and like the religious beliefs that drive him in a very clear like cynical light. Also, while not made explicit, the disconnect and like, animosity between him and Yuri is implied, at least like in part, to be religious, because she has a poster sort of prominently displayed in her room for a death metal band called Hellthrone, with the words like "destroy the father" at the bottom, obviously with the word father having many possible meanings. And I think significantly, kind of the mending of their relationship, or like, at least the start of that process, involves him like accommodating to her. He listens to her music and like pretends to like it, and ultimately takes off his sort of goofy, anachronistic armor that he has been wearing throughout the film. And I think kind of in a way, almost like symbolically like sheds himself of like past tradition in order to join his daughter in like the modern world. At the same time, I think it is also possible to take a more like positive view, because Yuri's mother also seems to be estranged from him partially on like religious grounds, and herself sort of holds to more like pagan and like superstitious practices. He even refers to her at one point as being a witch. Thus, they kind of represent like two different worldviews that kind of must put their like differences aside and like come together and perhaps find like, sort of their unified fulfillment in the person of Yuri. And there even is like a brief moment near the end, kind of involving the gift of a knife, where Yuri herself seems to acknowledge that perhaps she has been wrong to like just totally reject her father and like his connection to the past. So I think kind of in that sense, the film's theme may also be one sort of more of like coexistence. Either way, I think kind of intentional or not, it seems clear, at least to me, that like, the Christian religion, at least the brand of it represented by Defoe's character, is presented in like a mostly negative light as being an obstacle in the way of, modernization and something silly and, misguided that is best left in the past in order to move into a brighter future. So, in the end, The Legend of Ochi is not without its charms. It is the type of movie that just seems to rarely get made in Hollywood today, but sadly, I think it's also a film that seems unlikely to inspire more. I really wanted to like this movie more than I did, but was just mostly left unsatisfied. I do think the creature effects alone make it a worthwhile creative endeavor, but it's very eccentric storytelling approach, and I think harsher tone will likely limit the audience of who can experience those impressive effects. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you really enjoyed this film, or maybe you felt more along the lines as I did, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, I encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. Got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith in Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with the world for Christ.